Rated the 8th best game of 2018 here on Digital Foundry by none other than myself, Dusk is a very good game. This dark, pixelated, nightmarish boomer shooter left a strong impact when it shipped on PC that very year. On the surface, it looks like it stepped straight out of 1997, but beneath the hood, Dusk is actually powered by the Unity engine. Now, this was no problem on PC, and remarkably, the experience felt rather authentic and old school despite using modern technology. But the Switch, well, we've seen some examples over the years of Unity-powered retro-themed productions that didn't exactly run well on the console. It's not something you can take for granted. And thus, I approached Dusk with cautious optimism on Switch. Could it really work on a gamepad? And even with its pixelated visuals, would it even run well? That's exactly what I want to talk about today. We have some details on the porting process to help shine a light on the difficulties faced when targeting lower-end hardware like this. And of course, we also have information on the performance and image quality, as well as the various features included in this version of the game. So, let's get into it. When discussing a game like Dusk, I admittedly take for granted that people watching this video are familiar with its inspirations, but I also realize that it may not always be the case. Dusk certainly doesn't look like a modern game, that's for sure. To put it simply, visually, Dusk was built to approximate the look and feel of a mid-90s software rasterized polygonal first-person action game. Think software-rendered Quake, the seminal id Software original unleashed in 1996. I made an hour-long DF Retro video just this very year exploring the subject. Check it out. The point is, this is the look, the aesthetic that Dusk is aiming for, and it does a commendable job of mimicking this very specific look. Its hand-painted textures, designed to seamlessly tile across large planes, lack any sort of bilinear interpolation. These textures proudly flaunt raw, pixelated texels, boldly eschewing bitmaps as they're carefully slathered across each map. The maps and denizens populating them then are made up of precious few polygons, lending the game a rather abstract appearance. The silhouette of its jagged architecture and low-color assets genuinely strengthen the nightmarish aesthetic Dusk so beautifully delivers. The thing is, modern game engines are not explicitly engineered with this style of presentation in mind. Whether you're using Unity, as is the case with Dusk, or Unreal Engine, building a retro shooter amounts to intentionally sidestepping many of the key visual features these engines are known for. Not every game manages to pull this off in a way that feels authentic. Strafe, for instance, another Unity game, is a good example of this. It just doesn't quite nail it. But Dusk does. And thankfully, the development team has managed to convey this beautifully on the Nintendo Switch, sacrificing very little in the process and even adding some things. Make no mistake, Dusk on Nintendo Switch is good. Very good, in fact. I'm not mincing words here when I suggest that of all the Unity conversions I've tested for the Switch over the years, Dusk is one of the absolute best. But despite that retro aesthetic, the task was anything but easy. Early in development, the Switch version barely cracked 20 frames per second, but as you can see now, this problem is a distant memory. Okay, so first, for you pixel counting maniacs out there, let's quickly talk resolution. Dusk is a game that just wouldn't work well with poor scaling, sub-native resolutions, or even reconstruction, I believe. And thus, I was surprised and impressed to see that it actually manages to deliver a native 1080p in docked mode, and a native 720p in portable mode. It features no anti-aliasing, the correct choice for this aesthetic, and offers additional visual customizations, including various color modes, which all can be fine-tuned by hand if you desire. If you need further pixelation for your boomer shooter experience, Dusk on Switch retains the pixel size adjustment feature found in the PC version. You can essentially mimic lower resolution display modes, giving the game an extra chunky feel. From 2x, a little bit as it's called, to Grandpa's 386, all the way to Dusk Boy Color at 8x. And if you want to take things even further, the retro color palette option remains as well. This essentially limits the available colors, simulating the look of what seems to be a 256 color DOS game rather effectively. Beyond this, the Switch version retains the ridiculous FOV options featured on PC. It defaults to 100, which is already pretty high, but it's possible to crank your FOV all the way up to 150 if you so desire. You can also change the weapon scale, the appearance of your crosshair, and a whole lot more. Basically what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of features here. Compared to the PC version running at 1080p, it looks nearly identical. Same textures, same meshes, everything. Well, almost. You see, this is where we get into the optimizations made in pursuit of high performance. Remember, when this port first entered development, it barely ran. Now it's pushing 60 frames per second. In terms of what's visible to the player, there are a couple key changes made in pursuit of faster performance. Firstly, the particles have been optimized and the density is somewhat scaled back as a result. You can see it with the rain in this stage already, but when engaging foes, you'll notice a reduction in the number of particles generated per scene. Secondly, dynamic lights have been pared back. You still get muzzle flash lighting, the flashlight, and some dynamic lights during combat, but as you can see in this scene, lighting from particles is completely absent. Well, to be clear, it's not completely absent from the player particles. Certain projectiles fired by your own weapons still produce dynamic lights, as you see in this scene. I suppose it's the possibility for the combination of player particles emitting light as well as enemy particles emitting light that resulted in this change. There are, of course, more subtle differences visible throughout the game, such as the slight texture tweaks in certain stages like this, among other subtle changes. But by and large, it's pixel perfect. Under the hood, however, there have been more profound changes made to the game. Firstly, the project itself was overhauled to a newer version of the Unity engine. In fact, according to the developer, they're now using 2020.2.0 F1. Secondly, from what I understand, the team went through every single map in the game with a fine-toothed comb in order to best optimize each of them for the Switch. It now relies more heavily on smart occlusion calling to avoid wasting resources on unnecessary geometry, while many of the game's meshes have been optimized and merged to further improve performance. In combat, shader-based resizing is used to prevent overdraw related to slowdown via alpha effects such as explosions. It essentially prevents them from filling the screen in such a way that it actually tanks the frame rate. The codebase itself was also heavily reworked with AI, physics, lighting, scripting, and a new reliance on Unity's job system standing as some of the necessary changes. Essentially, it was a lot of manual work done to ensure each map in the game runs as smoothly as possible while retaining the original look and feel inherent in Dusk. Simply running the original Unity project on a Switch would have resulted in a bad product. This is what you get when a lot of careful attention is poured into a specific version of a game. The effort, at least in this case, is certainly worth it. Beyond this, the menu system in UI has received some updates, with a superior level select screen, among other things, now being present in the game. Also, loading times. They're exceptionally quick on Switch, just a handful of seconds and you're in the game. Very much like the PC version, actually. On top of all this, there's even tweaks available for adjusting your controls, allowing you to carefully customize the game to fit your playstyle, including turning on gyro aim if you desire. All told, Dusk on the Switch is a highly robust port that's nearly perfect in terms of presentation, with just the slightest nips and tucks made to ensure a smooth frame rate. Speaking of frame rate, how did they do? Well, there is good news here. The game targets 60 frames per second, and it delivers that 60 frames per second. It does so without any hitching, camera stuttering, or any of the other issues we've observed in recent Unity releases on the Switch. It feels remarkably polished from top to bottom. In fact, in my testing, I captured and played through the entirety of the first 2 episodes of the game and part of the third. The frame rate was nearly flawless, save for 2 or 3 specific spots. The heaviest stage is the Erebus reactor. This one takes place primarily within this large space, surrounded by complex structures. It's an imposing map, and when you're first dropped into it, you'll be facing loads of enemies bearing down upon you from all directions. When this occurs, the frame rate can slip below 60 frames per second. Once you've dealt with this initial wave of enemies, however, the frame rate smooths itself out and you're back to a stable 60. The other area I noted is here. When fighting along the top of this stage, you'll end up seeing similar dips as those encountered in Erebus. But again, it's relatively minor. There was perhaps one other time I can recall, but really, that's it. Throughout these first 2 episodes, these 3 moments were the only moments I encountered any performance hiccups at all. It's that consistent. I guess we could say there's actually a 4th area, which is the endless mode. In this mode, the player selects a difficulty and they're dropped into a stage in which enemies spawn wave after wave. You deal with them in large numbers. By and large, the frame rate holds steady here, but during certain stage modifying events, you can get dips like this. Again though, it's very uncommon, even in endless mode. So it runs great in docked mode, but how about portable mode? Well, I found much the same results. By and large, the frame rate is locked to the 60 frames per second target. It feels every bit as responsive, and it looks remarkably sharp on the Switch's internal screen, especially when using the OLED model. The areas where the docked mode performance trips up just a bit, however, still exhibit the same issue in portable mode. Of course, it's not possible to obtain complete like-for-like gameplay in a title like this, but I do have a suspicion that it might actually be slightly better in portable mode, which is something we've seen before on the Switch. Either way, it runs exceptionally well in this mode and looks great while doing it. It's nice to have another game here running at the native 720p of the panel, similar to Metroid Dread. The thing is, this is a rather impressive accomplishment. You have it running at the highest possible resolution on Switch at 60 frames per second, and the consistency here is nearly flawless. That they were able to do this in a Unity game no less, with so many enemies often flooding the screen, well, it speaks volumes about the effort on display here. So yeah, performance is great, and visuals are highly accurate to the PC original. The final piece of the conversion puzzle then is of course the audio. The quality is up to par, I can report, and the iconic soundtrack created by Andrew Hulshult is fully intact. Alas, this is yet another Switch game that does not support surround sound audio playback, but honestly, I'm not even entirely sure the PC version does either, so perhaps this is just the way Dusk was designed to be. Either way, the soundscape is excellent. Here's a sample. So yeah, that's Dusk on Switch in a nutshell. It's an exceptionally well-made conversion of one of the best boomer shooters of the last few years. There's a reason why the game itself came in at number 8 on my 2018 Game of the Year list. It may not have been the best game that year, but it was definitely up there, at least for me. The reason I wanted to cover it in this video though is that I thought it was worthwhile highlighting this game on Switch, as it's a perfect example of what a good port to the platform looks like. There's no caveats here either. This is a near flawless iteration of Dusk. The point is, if you were looking forward to playing Dusk on Switch, there's no need to worry about any technical hiccups here. It's good. And hopefully you found this video good as well, or at least reasonably informative, because that's the end of it. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring that notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry, and follow us on Twitter. But until next time, I'll see you in hell.